A lot of the time, creative people emerge into the public eye, and their audience becomes obsessed with not only their work, but their life too. People want to know why someone acts the way they do, and it's comforting to be able to see a piece of artwork, attribute it to the creator, then discover aspects about the creator's life that led to the conception of the art. 9 times out of 10, the life of the artist doesn't fully match the context of their artwork, but sometimes it does. Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1809. His father abandoned his family after his mother got pregnant with his sister. Then when he was 2 years old, his mother died of tuberculosis, and he and his siblings were separated. Already, this history makes our ears perk up. His work is some that we can only imagine being constructed by someone with a tortured mind, and every hint of trauma and neglect that we find in his past leads us to understanding his creative motivations. Poe ended up being raised by a wealthy couple, John and Frances Allan, in Richmond, Virginia. He attended the University of Virginia for a year and left due to lack of funds. When he was 18, he enlisted in the Army but decided to leave his role as officer cadet to become a writer. Throughout his early 20s, he focused on writing horror stories that revolved around internal struggles and latent fears. One of his most famous quotes is, "The scariest monsters are the ones that lurk within our souls." His 1839 horror story, The Fall of the House of Usher, centered around Roderick and his sister Madeline, the final surviving members of the Usher family. A main part of the story is that neither Roderick nor Madeline have any descendants, meaning their family's name will end with them, signifying the collapse of the family's legacy. 3 years before The Fall of the House of Usher was written, Poe married his 13-year-old cousin Virginia Clem. At this time, it was common for families to have a dozen children, as a way to continue the family line and ensure an heir. There was no birth control, extremely high infant mortality rates, and a need for children to contribute work to the family. But when The Fall of the House of Usher was released, Poe was 30 years old and he had no heirs. Again, it seems his real life is permeating his material, as he writes a story centered around the anxiety of a family dynasty ending suddenly. This book was eventually adapted into a Netflix limited series in 2023, where it included Roderick Usher's children, all of whom were named after figures or themes in Poe's life and stories, and all of whom meet deaths that match their individual hubris. The oldest Usher child is named Frederick. Poe's novel Metzengerstein followed the story of a baron named Frederick, who inherits his family fortune after his parents die mysteriously in a fire, marking his descent into immoral behaviors. The baron's story might be some wishful thinking on Poe's part, that his parents could have been lost in an accidental fire under mysterious circumstances, rather than the true story of his father abandoning him and his mother succumbing to illness. The second Usher child is named Tamerlane, a reference to Poe's poem Tamerlane about a warrior regretting his life's choices, specifically the choice to give up love for his own ambition. This sentiment is mimicked in Tamerlane Usher's character, with her complex, detached relationship with her husband and her downfall relating to incessant personal growth. This story and this character outline Poe's own preoccupation with ambition. The third child is Victorine Lafourcade. The name Victorine is a reference to the premature burial, which used being buried alive partially as a metaphor for being overlooked. With his past as an abandoned child and his experience as a foster child who was never formally adopted, Poe clearly had some insecurities with his identity and whether or not he was truly cared for. The fourth child is Camille. Her name is a reference to one of the victims in the murders in the Rue Morgue, a location that gets referenced in the show too. This detective story was written in 1841, 2 years before the noun detective was added to the Oxford English Dictionary. Camille, like her father, is extremely ambitious, to a fault, and constantly sacrifices connection with her family for personal achievement. The fifth child is Napoleon, or Leo, named after a satirical poem, The Duc de l'Omelette, which pokes fun at decadence. The inclusion of this character, who is killed by his own indulgence, is possibly a reference of the showrunners to Poe's indulgence in both alcohol and gambling. And the sixth and final child is Prospero. His name is a reference to the Mask of the Red Death, which tells the story of Prospero, a prince who isolates himself in his home to escape a spreading disease called the Red Death. He throws an elaborate masquerade ball, which the manifestation of the disease infiltrates and kills everyone. Like Leo, his indulgence and obsession with debauchery leads to his own downfall. Prospero also goes by the nickname Perry in the show, which was the name Edgar used to publish his first collection, that collection being Tamerlane and Other Poems. It appears that the depiction of each child in the show has been intentionally injected with a deep sense of vanity. Frederick is obsessed with control and feels entitled to it as the eldest son. Tamerlane constantly pursues fame and wealth through her Goldbug brand, and she's stabbed to death by broken shards of a mirror, a literal emblem of vanity. Napoleon's only concern is himself throughout the entire show. He cheats on his boyfriend with no remorse, kills that same boyfriend's cat, and only becomes anxious in his journey to replace it out of fear of being caught. Camille constantly exploits others, including her own family's trauma and her assistance for selfish gain. Victorine strives for commendation from her father and the world by experimenting on animals and covering it up. And Perry's own self-involvement led to his downfall, as he doesn't listen in the board meeting about the chemical runoff, so he hooks up the water lines to the tanks and lets acid rain down. In the climate when the show was released, this selfish, unlikable family was a commentary on billion-dollar corporations not caring about the people they seem to serve.
Life hands you lemons.
Make lemonade.
You charge 40% more for organic lemons, 50% more for conflict-free lemons. You pack the capital with lemon lobbyists, then you patent the seeds. You write a line of genetic code, you cross-pollinate, you get those seeds circulating in the wild, and then you sue the farmers for copyright infringement when that genetic code shows up on their land. Sit back, rake in the millions, and then, when you're done, and you've sold your lempire for a few $1 billion, then, and only then, you make some fucking lemonade.
But it stemmed from Poe's own critiques of selfishness in stories like The System of Dr. Tar, where he satirized social hierarchies. So here, we clearly see how events of his own life bleed into his stories, and how assumptions about his personality are infused into characters in modern adaptations of his novels. So his stories are him, but it still presents the question if he is his stories. Outside of his work, if we take a look into his personal life, his work's subject matter begins to make more and more sense. In 1815, he began attending a boarding school in London, a great influence on his Gothic writing. Years later, in 1824, his mother's childhood friend, Jane Stannard, who was a major influence in his life and on his writing, succumbed to mental illness. His foster mother dies of illness in 1829, he marries Virginia Clem, and like his birth mother, she dies of tuberculosis in 1847. So he has all these tragic experiences, paired with an inspiring experience in a Gothic location and a good private education. Nearly 2 centuries later, he's still one of the most renowned poets and a forefather of Gothic writing. This must lead him to being an incredibly fulfilled and happy individual. Edgar Allan Poe is believed to have struggled from a myriad of mental health issues, like depression, anxiety, and possibly bipolar disorder. Aside from people's recollections of consistent mood swings and his reliance on substances, one could infer a number of illnesses from his dark stories that explore themes of madness and isolation. Part of the reason for his mental health struggles comes simply from the time in which he was a writer. In the early 19th century, the publishing industry was ruthless. The copyright laws were very weak, the industry was exploitative, and the pay was abysmal. For example, The Raven is often crowned as Poe's most influential and widely known work, but when it was published in 1845, he only earned $9 from it. That would be about $373 today. This poor payment for work led him to be in financial ruin for most of his adult life, made worse by his excessive spending on his vices. He turned to alcohol to cope with losses, and turned to gambling while at the University of Virginia to pay for his tuition since his foster father refused to financially support him. At one point, his financial insecurity forced him to learn to survive on bread and molasses for months at a time. One of the most interesting developments that came as a result of the tragedy surrounding him was his increasing interest in 19th century medicine. In short, after his friend Jane Stannard, who he referred to as the first purely ideal love of my soul, died from a mental illness, Poe began to study publications about phrenology to understand troubled minds. Phrenology is the pseudoscience of studying the shape and size of the skull in order to predict a person's mental abilities and character traits. Researching these studies from the American Phrenological Journal led to the conception of stories like The Fall of the House of Usher, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat. So in this instance, we see a clear cause and effect, but in other events in his life, it's not this simple. Of course, a Gothic writer with an air of intrigue and a past of tragedy has to be surrounded by mystery, and Edgar Allan Poe has had his fair share. In 1849, 2 years after his wife died, Poe was depressed and drinking heavily, contributing to his erratic behavior and declining health. He ended up engaged to Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton, a woman he had known since childhood. But 10 days before they were to be married, he was found wandering through the streets of Baltimore wearing someone else's clothes. His friend Joseph Snodgrass took him to a hospital, and only days later, he died. On his deathbed, Poe repeatedly screamed the word Reynolds, a figure who has never been identified. His attending physician attributed his death to brain fever and phrenitis, but a number of theories exist for the cause of his mysterious death. Alcohol poisoning, encephalitis, and carbon monoxide poisoning from coal gas are all common theories. But one of the most interesting ones is the cooping theory. Cooping was basically a form of electoral fraud where people were kidnapped and forced to vote multiple times in different disguises. Coup managers would get the victims belligerently drunk and force them to vote. In 1842, the Weekly Globe wrote that the Federalist Party during the last presidential election introduced all these contrivances: bribing, thumbing, bullying, and the abduction of voters steeped in drunkenness. This theory honestly makes sense, as Poe was found semi-conscious in ill-fitting clothes in a Baltimore polling place by a newspaper reporter. But it crumbles due to yet another unexplained mystery. In the pocket of the ill-fitting stranger's clothes, there was a key to Poe's trunk, raising the question of why one of his personal items would be found in a stranger's clothes. Then, the mysteries and vaguely Gothic occurrences continue after his death. In 1875, Poe's remains were moved to a different location and given a proper monument, and the coffin crumbled and his skeleton fell out. Even after his death, occurrences surrounding him seemed to match the dark themes that his writing was based around. For decades, beginning in 1949, the Poe toaster regularly appeared at Poe's grave in the middle of the night, leaving behind 3 roses and a bottle of cognac. This ritual transformed into a popular tradition, with fans gathering outside to get a glimpse of the figure. Cryptic notes would be regularly left as well, and the identity of the Poe toaster was never uncovered. A number of strange coincidences occurred as well, from his ongoing fear of being buried alive and the insistent controversy surrounding his own burial, to his writing about water on the moon in the unparalleled adventure of One Han's Fall, and the eventual discovery of water on Mars. Poe's life was riddled with hardships and mysterious events that matched the tone of his stories. Poe, as a person, often felt like one of his Gothic tales come to life. If we look into his background, we can find reasons for his macabre creativity. He's related to creative parents. Both of his birth parents were actors, a profession that was highly looked down upon in the early 19th century for their work taking place in drinking and gambling establishments, the stigma around nighttime professions, and the idea that their profession, which was based around facades and personal success, made them vain hedonists. Romantic writers who were devoted to Shakespeare often saw theatrical adaptations of these works as disruptions of the integrity of the original work, which they believed was best consumed through imagination purely in the mind. He was also orphaned at a young age, and faced heaps of trauma as he watched nearly every person around him die. Sometimes the best way to come to terms with loss like this is to dive into it head first and find beauty and entertainment in the grim words. There's a reason why Gothic literature and horror movies and true crime stories are entertaining. Sometimes people like confronting their own fears for that rush. Poe's complex relationship with death might have come from witnessing people succumb to tuberculosis, a disease that often makes people look dead. With the premature burial stories and the telltale heart, it's clear that he had some fear about what might exist in the thin line between life and death. And it wouldn't be surprising for him to extract this experience and use it as inspiration for his own works. People witnessing tuberculosis victims at the time were already transforming this grim sight into something enticing. The look associated with tuberculosis was called consumptive chic, and it was characterized by the pale complexion, red cheeks and lips, and thin physique. It was romanticized and recreated to display what was seen in the 19th century as tragic beauty. So people internalized their fears and present it in a more digestible way, to lessen the fear, maybe explore it, and avoid the paralysis of true terror. The desire to find a connection between art and artist is not a new development. After Poe's death, his literary rival Rufus Griswold defamed his character by writing his obituary. He painted him as a mentally ill drunk and used his obituary as a way to get revenge on Poe for criticizing his work in the Boston Miscellany and solidify the similarities between Poe and his characters.
Griswold succeeded in establishing the modern perception of Poe, really as the same person as one of the characters in his stories.
Part of the intrigue of figures like Edgar Allan Poe is our assumption that their day-to-day life and personality match their creative contributions. For example, Agatha Christie was a mystery writer. Her having an experience going missing for weeks, then being found under mysterious circumstances kind of delights her audience, because it tells us that she is inextricably linked with mystery. But this intrigue can get out of hand. Audiences had a firm idea of what Marilyn Monroe should be. In many of her roles, she played the ditzy blonde bombshell. In Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, director Howard Hanks depicts her as a gold-digging, unintelligent woman, even though Monroe was highly intelligent, holding an IQ of 165, displaying impressive comedic skills, and creating a female-based production company. I visited the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond, Virginia, and the gift shop was filled with dark, Gothic books, keychains, and posters. One item was a little figure in a coffin, but I can't find a picture of it, so this picture of coffin earrings will have to do. But it just made me feel strange, that this person was terrified his whole life of being buried alive, and in his museum, he's immortalized by a number of marketable objects from his stories, like a skull, a raven, or a black cat, even though he was terrified of them. That being said, they also had this Christmas ornament that had one golden pristine side and one Gothic damaged side, and I thought it did a better job of outlining the duality of his character. He is known for the dark Gothic nature of his stories, his life surrounded by death, and his death surrounded by mystery. But in some ways, he was just a normal human. So I bought the ornament. It was cool, sue me. So I bought the ornament. It was cool, sue me. It was cool. So I bought the ornament. It was cool, sue me.